E.T. first graced our screens in June of 1982, and since then, it is a go-to family film that every parent should be showing their children. And for me personally, this is my all-time favorite Steven Spielberg film. Let's talk about it. Greetings, Designing Hollywood movie fans and beyond. I am your host, Oliver Ricketts. Steven Spielberg is the greatest filmmaker of all time. Hot take, I know. But I do feel like some of the revisionist film historians on the internet have forgotten this simple, objective fact. And you want an even hotter take? Steven Spielberg is my favorite filmmaker. And I know this is not a very in vogue opinion in 2024. Because yes, there are younger and some might even say cooler filmmakers out there to be your favorite. A Christopher Nolan, a Safdie brothers, Greta Gerwig, the list goes on. But has any filmmaker, other than maybe Alfred Hitchcock, ever had a more diverse and satisfying, solid filmography like Steven Spielberg has? I don't think so. And I'll admit, it has been years since I have loved a Steven Spielberg movie. I believe the last one was Catch Me If You Can. In fact, there are quite a few recent Steven Spielberg films that I not only dislike, but I hate. Many of them so boring that it actually moves me to tears. But by the same token, there have been quite a few recently that I like, including The Fabelmans and his version of West Side Story, which I believe to be the superior version. However, even if Spielberg never puts out another A-plus film, nobody will ever be able to duplicate his existing track record. Let's quickly examine this filmography from the late 70s to the early 2000s. Jaws, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, my second favorite Spielberg film. Raiders of the Lost Ark, E.T., Temple of Doom, The Color Purple, The Last Crusade, Hook, Jurassic Park, Schindler's List, Saving Private Ryan, AI, Minority Report, Catch Me If You Can. The man did nothing but consecutively bring us excellence for over 2 decades. Overrated? I think not. But with all of these excellent picks scattered across his filmography, what makes E.T. the best one? The most timeless, the most palatable. E.T. is simply just one of those movies that is difficult to put into words. But this is a video where I talk about movies, so I'm going to try. And so rather than telling you why E.T. is a wonderful movie and why you should watch it, because you already know that, today we're going to revisit the format I used last time we talked about Spielberg, and I'm going to give you the top 5 reasons that E.T. is Spielberg's best film. But before we jump into this, I do want to take a minute to tell you all about our sponsor, Gardena Cinema. And I'd especially like to point out Gardena Cinema because recently they did their very own showing of E.T., which I'm sure was magical for everybody in the theater. This movie plays so well at a cinema. It is one of the best definitions of the power of movies when played on the big screen. And Gardena Cinema has a wonderful screen to do this on. If you're in Southern California, this family-owned theater is a must-go-to destination for any movie fan. They play old and new movies of all different genres, types, and eras, and there's sure to be one in there that will make for a nice night out for you and a friend. I'll be leaving their showing schedule as well as their social media in the description below, so you can check them out and make a night out for yourself at the movies. Reason number 5, my personal connection. For a lot of people, I think that E.T. is a movie that defines childhood. This is almost the universal movie, next to maybe Toy Story, of film that you should show to your children. And maybe this is why it's not always in the conversation for favorite movie as an adult. Because as a child, it's magical, it pulls you in, and then maybe as you grow up and experience more films and maybe films that you can choose, you forget about all of the magic that this movie has to offer. However, I don't have this connection with this movie. I think maybe it surprises people because I list this movie in my top 10 films of all time, but E.T. was not a very big part of my childhood almost at all, because I watched this movie exactly 1 time as a child and I didn't finish it. I was 4 years old and they were playing the film on cable. And I remember my father being so excited to show the movie to me and my older sister. And he sat us down to watch it on a Tuesday night, and it was a wonderful experience. Because while I was still young, I remember not only being sucked into the movie, but everybody else being sucked in and equally invested in that same movie. Something that I had not experienced yet in my life. And then 8 p.m. rolled around, and my mother came in. It was time for us to go to bed. Again, 4 years old. But E.T. wasn't over yet. In fact, we were at a pivotal turning point in the movie. A government man was coming into the house to take a presumed dead E.T. away from the family and study him. And this was the last shot of the movie that I saw that night. And although my father promised to tape the end of the movie for us, we never saw that tape. And that was the last time before my teenage years that I watched this movie. Much like Alf in real life, E.T. in my head ended with the government coming to take E.T. away and dissect him, because that was the last frame that I saw of it. Needless to say, E.T. was not a big part of my childhood. But I always remember that unique experience of watching it with my dad and my sister before we got cut off. It was one of the first really special connections that I had with a movie. And that's a feeling that I've chased throughout the rest of my life, from being a film pundit to a film enjoyer and a filmmaker. And so at 16, when I was first getting into movies in a serious way, consuming as many films as humanly possible, trying to catch up on the entire history of cinema, E.T. was one of the first stops on the docket. And when I watched it, it blew my mind. Just the absurd charm of this movie and how at home you feel when you are watching it. And ever since that first viewing as a teenager, it has lived in my mind as a masterpiece. Later, as an adult, as many of the movies that I love often do, it also strengthened the relationship between myself and my wife, who did grow up watching E.T. For her, the movie is just so laced with nostalgia. One thing about our relationship is that finding movies that we can fixate on and celebrate together is something that brings us closer together, and it's something that I really enjoy about the time that I spend with my wife. And so E.T., while not a huge part, is a small and very appreciated part of our relationship and our marriage. Reason number 4, movie tie-ins. Similar to what we discussed in Jaws, I love movie merchandising, especially movie merchandising from the 80s, when toys and action figures were just absolutely on the rise. When action figure commercials and Saturday morning cartoons were just a huge part of every kid's life. I find tie-in merchandising from this era just so charming. And I love especially that the merchandising from E.T. lives on today. The plush toys, the infamous video game that was thought to be so terrible at the time that it had to be removed from shelves and sent directly to a landfill, but today is a priceless collectible. The countless insane E.T. ripoff films, including but not limited to McDonald's own Mac and Me. Today, leftover merchandising, as well as still produced legacy material, cements E.T.'s place as a permanent fixture in our collective pop culture. Of course, my personal favorite E.T. movie tie-in is the Universal Studios ride, which is a reminder of how great theme park rides can be.
Goodbye, Vincent, Jaden, Kristen, Sam.
Full of vintage animatronics and unbridled nostalgia. Of course, as with many Steven Spielberg films, the product placement is even part of the merchandising here. Because while M&M's famously passed on being E.T.'s favorite candy, it is so fun every time we see Reese's Pieces remind us that they were the candy that united E.T. and Elliot.
E.T.'s back.
Another piece of real life that is just so seamlessly folded into this classic piece of fiction. And folks, before we move on to reason number 3, I do want to remind you that if you love movies and talking about film, you are in the right place. Please consider subscribing to Designing Hollywood's YouTube channel and liking this video so that you see more content like it. We talk about movies of all different types, from independent to major blockbusters, from all eras. Of course, if you're a film fan, you'll also want to check out the Designing Hollywood podcast, where we talk to industry professionals like cinematographers, costume designers, and any number of artists behind the scenes who make the movies you love the movies you love. A link to all of this will be in the description below. Reason number 3, Steven Spielberg's personal connection. I personally think the success of any movie comes down to how much the creative team can relate and attach to it. Even the most outlandish films need just one small element that a regular person can look at and say, that reminds me of part of my life, and now I'm invested in this story. And that starts with the cast and crew themselves. Spielberg has talked at length about how this movie is his original autobiography, decades before The Fabelmans. Because this movie at its heart is just a literal translation of a young Steven Spielberg navigating his parents' divorce and playing with his imaginary friend, who of course becomes E.T. And all of those raw emotions and the feeling of being a child, that innocence, have just translated so wonderfully here. And it makes sense that this is a lived-in story that is somewhat autobiographical, because we see this family type, these kinds of characters, and this story model all over his career, from Poltergeist all the way to The Fabelmans. And while we're discussing the creative team feeling an emotional connection, we have to talk about the children here. This film, of course, features a young Henry Thomas and an even younger Drew Barrymore. And when I say young, these kids are young. They are children so young that they absolutely should not be able to process and emote the raw emotions on display here. It is no small feat that when Elliot says goodbye to E.T., you feel it too. That is true artistry in filmmaking, and it's achieved by shooting the movie in sequence. For the kids, E.T. had to feel real, so all of their scenes are shot in the order that they happen in the movie. By the time E.T. is saying goodbye to Elliot, Henry Thomas is saying goodbye to E.T. in real life, as that is their last day on set. And I think it's such a small thing to have done, but it just elevates the emotions and the realness felt in this movie. Reason number 2, the iconic score. Well, I suppose we can debate if Spielberg is truly the most iconic director to ever live. I don't think anyone will fight me when I say that John Williams is the greatest movie composer of all time. From Star Wars to Harry Potter to Indiana Jones to Jaws, nothing but excellence from this man. And E.T. is one of his crowning achievements. I listen to the score from The Bicycle Chase all the time, and I get emotional when I hear the main theme, thinking about how invested I got in this little puppet. Of course, one of my favorite little facts about this movie is that the iconic bike chase was actually edited around John Williams' pre-existing score, rather than the composer writing the music over the scene. And because of that, we get one of my favorite jump cuts in all of cinema. Reason number 1, E.T. is real, at least to me. I know he's a puppet. He's one of the best on-screen puppets in the history of movies. But with all the personality that they managed to channel through this little puppet, can you really blame the irrational part of my brain for just assuming that that's a real-life alien? How he moves, how he talks, how he draws you into believing that this is a real, otherworldly creature who has been left behind from his family and just wants to go home. It's one of the best practical effects in any movie, and the real star of this film is the puppeteering team that bring him to life. Folks, all in all, E.T. has brought me more joy than I could ever tell you, and underlines just why I love cinema so much. It truly is the greatest cinematic effort from one of the greatest cinematic minds of our time. For Designing Hollywood, I'm Oliver Ricketts, and until next time, get out there and go see a movie.